So my final topic I want to discuss, and this is another one that there's a lot of interest in, obviously, is the Second Amendment and what your view on it is.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think Heller was a wrong decision, in my own opinion. That's my own opinion. It's a very hot take, but I believe that if we look at the actual history of the Second Amendment uh, in the historical context, and based off, as a history student and looking at this stuff, the reason it was created was initially for indigenous death squads essentially to steal Native American territory and violate a number of treaties that we had created with Native Americans, for people that were settling further and further west in and direct violation of Native sovereignty. Then after that, it went on to become part of slave patrols and having a well-regulated militia, to help patrol people and own people and, help provide for the entire system of injustice and horror that was slavery in the United States. And after the end of slavery, that well-regulated militia went on to become policing. In some ways, it went on to become the National Guard. And that's still what I see it as. I don't see it necessarily as it was reviewed in Heller as an individual right necessarily. I think if we actually are talking about specifically what was meant in the original, kind of founding, I believe it's a collective right of states, to have something like a national guard or a policing system in the first place. I don't think it was ever talking about an individual right. And that's my own opinion. People are not going to agree with that. That's a very hot take on constitutional law, on history, and a number of other instances. But in the same ways that people are entitled to their own opinions, that's my own view. And there are plenty of people that disagree with me on that, but that's just how I see it.
Yeah, I want to question the logic of the point you made there, which is to point out that because the Second Amendment was born in a particular historical context that was racist and colonialist, that therefore that should bear on our assessment of it today. Like that's a logic I don't think goes through, because if you apply that standard to, say, Planned Parenthood, one of whose founder was a eugenicist or very close to it, by that logic you should oppose Planned Parenthood today.
But I also think there's a difference there, in that Planned Parenthood is not the Constitution of the United States. What I'm talking about here is the specific historic context of a founding document, right? That's what I'm talking about.
But the logic should be the same, or it's like a thing isn't defined by the circumstances of its birth necessarily, because things change, greatly over time. For instance, New York City's gun laws were famously, constructed in a hotbed of anti-Italian and nativist sentiment, where people, one of the judges that ruled on a important case in New York City said something very racist about Italians in the opinion, right? And that was part of how New York City's gun laws came about in the 20th century. But that doesn't mean that shouldn't influence my assessment of whether the gun laws in the city are good or bad today, or how they should be changed. I think it's wrong to condemn something by the circumstances of its birth.
Well, I think but I believe it's still necessarily to acknowledge the historical context in which, yes, in that instance of the use of gun laws, it was racist, for example, or was nativist in many ways. It's also important to acknowledge how gun ownership in the United States has also been racist in many ways as well, while acknowledging there are certain nuances, obviously, with, the abolition of slavery and a number of other instances that have happened in the time since. But the main point that I was trying to get out there is that from my own view, in the way that it was written, even if, putting aside that specific historical context around slavery and indigenous, basically death squads for the annexation of the illegal annexation of native territory, I think the point that I'm getting at is how it was, and in my view, still is a collective right. And it's not necessarily an individual right in the way that it was written in the first place. That's the point that I'm getting at, while still talking about what I see as some of the more problematic roots that should be acknowledged, in the same way that some of the problematic roots at times, even with gun control, should be acknowledged too. So that's the point that I'm getting at there.